Okay, so instead of talking about any anime today, we're going to talk about something that's actually cool, which is a country tier list. Now, before any outrage happens, this is a geography based list. I'm not looking at politics. I truly have no care. I don't care about the politics of man. I don't care about government infrastructures. What I'm looking at is the land and geographical advantage that each country offers. Now, I am going to say up front, this is not going to be every country in the world. There's too many of them, and a lot of them are just going to be the same thing over and over again. So we're only going to be doing, I'm going to say the top maybe 30 to 35 based on GDP. Now I'm going off of World Bank data from 2018, which is not perfect, but it's the best I can really do, and I think it's fairly accurate as to like the 35 most noteworthy countries right now. So that's what we're going to be going off of. Now I'm not gonna belittle your guys' intelligence. I'm gonna assume you're familiar with what geographical advantage is, and rather than explain things and thought processes, I figure we'll do it as we go. It will cut down on video time and make for, in my opinion, a slightly better video. So you can see here with tiers, we have A, B, C, D, F. I took out E tier, I took out S tier and replaced it with God tier because, well, we'll get to that. So I figure we're going to start with the big three. Now the big three, according to me, are China, Russia, and the United States. And we'll actually start with the United States, which is going to be all the way down here. And this is God tier. This is, without a doubt, God tier. Now let's talk about why. So first off, just in sheer size, I believe the United States is currently third. Well, I say currently, it's not growing. I believe it's third right now, right? In terms of overall land mass. It's something like 9.8 million square kilometers, something around there. Now, here's the thing. What the United States has is not only a lot of landmass, it's not only big, but there's no dead areas in the United States. What makes the United States God tier, there are many reasons we'll go into, but chief among them is that every part of the United States can be used. Now, do not get me wrong. I'm not saying every part of the United States is currently being utilized to its fullest potential. I'm not a fucking idiot. I wouldn't say that. That being said, there's absolutely no place in the United States that is inhospitable or cannot be used in some way or another. Next up, let's talk about war. Let's talk about invasions. So you have your three possible invasion strategies, which is air, land, and water. Now, the United States is susceptible to all three of these things because we have other countries bordering us, so that gives way to a land invasion. We obviously, every country in the world has air, and we also are on the ocean. A lot of ocean. So you'd think that'd be a detriment, right? But in reality, the United States has even more advantage in this regard than you might think. Now, I know what you're saying. You're like, oh, Squid, you idiot, you're forgetting about the Rocky Mountains. That is bad in an invasion because it divides the country. No, 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 no. What that means is that a sea-based invasion is pretty much negligible because what would happen, at some point or another, a large force would have to cross the Rockies, which is essentially just a huge natural barrier that we have, which forces enemies into a checkpoint. So that's actually a huge plus. That means that sea-based invasions are not that good. Next up, we have air, and as we all know, the best defense against an air-based invasion is size. And there's only two countries, I believe two countries in the entire world that are actually bigger than the United States. So we have that said as well. Air invasions really don't work. Next up, land. Now, we'll get into this more when we talk about Canada, but Canada really doesn't have that much actual land in terms of building up a huge force to invade with. Mexico is also just a natural choke point. So really the United States is as good as it gets. It's a huge country, a lot of land. All of that land is usable, it's livable, it's great for agriculture, raising animals, raising crops. On top of that, invasion is insanely difficult. And then when people do invade, the country has very useful natural borders and divides in it. So without a doubt, the United States is God tier. I mean, there's no country on earth that is anywhere near it. The United States is the best country possible when it comes to geography, which probably contributed a lot to its very rapid rise in the ranks. But again, we're not getting into that. This is just geography. So United States is God tier. Next up, we're going to talk about China. Now, China, in my opinion, is actually going to be A tier. Now, a lot of people are going to be mad at that, and I understand. I know that I need to justify myself for why it's above B tier. Now, hear me out. China is very similar to the United States in that there aren't a lot of huge dead zones in the country. So most of the country is usable land, livable land. It's large. I believe it's just smaller than the U.S. I think it's the U.S., if I'm remembering correctly, is 9.8 or 9.9 million square kilometers, and China is like 9.5. So very similar in size. However, where China really loses is just in, first of all, actually no, not first of all, chief among them is invasion potential. So it has the same thing with the United States. Air is not nearly as useful against a huge country. You might think it's the opposite, where having a lot of area would mean that there's more places for you to fly into, but realistically, that's just not how it works. And on top of that, when we're talking about land, China gets fucking owned compared to the United States when it comes to a land invasion. Whereas I would say that the U.S. probably is like, what, 30 or 40% max bordered by land. China is like 60%, maybe even upwards of like 65% bordered by land. On top of that, it's land, if this makes sense, it's land with a lot of other land. So it's very easy for a big force to migrate into China. Now, they do have similar things to our Rocky Mountain, just not as good. That's why, to me, China is A tier. China is very similar to the United States in terms of its geography, just slightly worse in every aspect. So that means it's A tier. Now, you can dislike the video if you want, but I truly believe that China is A tier. Next up, we're going to talk about Russia. Now, here's the thing. I know a lot of you probably think I'm very biased towards Russia, and I get that. I mean, you know, I gotta pay respect to the motherland. Sometimes, this is not one of those times. I'm not gonna let my nostalgic bias for Russian food blind me. Russia is fucking D tier. And I can just hear outcry now, oh, Squid, it's the largest country in the world, 17 fucking million square kilometers. No, those 17 million square kilometers can literally eat shit and die because most of them are uninhabitable and worthless. Russia could literally cut its landmass down by like 60% and it wouldn't even notice. Literally the only thing keeping Russia out of F tier is the fact that it's very, very well equipped against a water-based invasion and an air-based invasion. Other than that, it's fucking trash. I hate this country geographically. Okay, next up, we got to talk about, well, I mean, if we're going off of the list, we have to talk about Japan if we're going in order, which I suppose we will. Japan, for me, I know a lot of people are probably thinking put Japan like around F or D tier. I'm actually putting Japan C tier. Now, something we didn't talk about a whole lot with the United States or Russia is natural disasters. And that's because, really, the United States is not at a huge risk for natural disaster. The only two that are a really big problem are earthquakes and hurricanes. Now, hurricanes are definitely the more severe of the two, but they're negligible. And so, as of right now, so are earthquakes. They're getting worse, but not to the point where it's going to like fracture the country. Same with Russia. There's not a huge amount of natural disaster threat. Japan, however, is another story. Japan is very susceptible to earthquakes, tsunamis, basically all the bad shit that you don't want. And unlike the United States or a much larger country, Japan doesn't really have the land mass for this. I mean, a big enough tsunami could go all the way over Japan. Which you're probably thinking, why isn't it F tier? If it's so susceptible to natural disaster, then why isn't it F tier? Well, the interesting thing about Japan is despite it being a really small country, it actually is pretty diverse in its environments. And so that means that at the end of the day, Japan, although it is a small island, is very self-contained. I mean, you need no more proof other than the fact that for the longest time, I mean, up until what year is it? 2020? So like 200 something years ago, or maybe even less than that, like 190. Pretty recently, within the last couple centuries, Japan was completely cut off from the world. There was no import-export. Japan has always been able to just completely support itself. And again, you're probably thinking, based off of my earlier discussion about air invasion, that a smaller country like Japan would be more susceptible, but here's the thing. What Japan is, or I suppose it isn't a series of islands. That makes you think of something like Hawaii, that fucking disgrace of a state. What Japan is, it does have natural blocks in it. So that would mean that an air invasion would have to be very spread out, which means that they may be small in terms of relative surface area, but they utilize it very well. On top of that, a land invasion, completely not possible. So to me, that bumps it up hugely. I mean, if you're able to completely eliminate one of those, that's big fucking money moves. Japan is also, since it's an island, has massive resources available to it in the water. Next up, we have possibly my personal favorite current country, which is maybe going to be a little controversial because a lot of people are going to be like, why is it your favorite country? It sucks. And that's Germany. I like Germany a lot, but not necessarily because of their geography. That being said, their geography isn't detrimental, which is why they're going B tier. Now let's explain why. Germany is very similar to the United States, just like China was. That being said, Germany is even smaller than China. In fact, I don't know this off the top of my head, but I think Germany might be one of the most densely populated countries in Europe. That's probably not true, but Germany is very, very densely populated. In terms of its actual land mass, it's all pretty well used and usable. It has access to water. The biggest detriments to it are its size. It just isn't, I mean, thank God for the world Germany isn't a lot bigger, because everything would probably be much different if it was. And on top of that, it's a border to, how many countries share a border with Germany? There's Denmark, Poland, Czech Republic, Switzerland, Austria, France, Belgium, I think 9 countries. I think Germany is bordered by 9 countries. Oh, wait. I could have just counted on this picture. Anyways, I think Germany is bordered by 9 countries, which is a huge disadvantage. Country markers might be arbitrary and created by man, but it is so technically not a part of the geography. Or actually, no, they are. So we have to include them. So the United States, for example, our only S tier, is bordered by only 2 countries. That's huge advantage. Germany being bordered by 9 means that's 9 potential threats on top of air and sea, like we've been talking about. But just like our Rocky Mountains, there's the Alps, which are basically anything that's inconvenient for you would be inconvenient for an invading force. And Germany's one of the 7 countries, 8 countries, however many countries that have access to the Alps. Germany is one of those, so that's pretty poggers. I can't believe I just said a Twitch emote out loud. I actually genuinely should die for that. But anyways, we're going to move on. Next up, we have the United Kingdom. And in my opinion, the United Kingdom is incredibly similar to Japan, except that it's fucking awful, so it's D tier with Russia. I mean, the fact that the UK was able to have its impressive war track record, or the track record that it does have, with its shitty fucking land masses, is absolutely mind-blowing to me. Fuck this country. This country sucks. It's D tier. I'm moving on. I don't like it. So next up we have France. We're going on GDP. France, in my opinion, is same tier as Germany, just slightly lower. Now, France, I know what you're thinking, right? France is like the 3rd biggest European country, so since it's bigger than Germany, surely it must be better. Well, bigger doesn't always mean better. And so France is bigger than Germany, and I believe it's bordered by 1 or 2 less countries. I'm not going to count because I'm too lazy. But the thing is, if we look at, I don't know how well you can see this, but if we look at France on the world map here, you'll notice something a little startling, and that is that it is deceptively surrounded by things. In fact, I would go as far to say that France is almost the perfect country to invade. It is wildly susceptible to land invasions on 2 extremes. Same with sea. It's almost like the Earth created a country where it was just basically meant to be pincer maneuvered from both sides on land and water. And obviously, it's just as susceptible to air as someplace like Germany. So to me, France gives off the appearance of, honestly, almost an A tier. At first glance, France belongs in A tier, but when you really start to think about it and think about how this would go down in an invasion, situation or how you would defend against enemies, France starts to fall apart. Now, it is all usable land. I believe France was like, what was it? Like, it was a pretty heavily forested area at one point. I'm pretty sure those idiots cut down all their trees. So it's not as densely wooded as it was. Were it still, very dense with trees, I think I would give it a slight bump up. Maybe it would be slightly above. No, I don't think even then it would be above Germany. I think this is right where France belongs. Okay, next up we have India, probably the most controversial country on this list. Now, I'm again thinking B tier personally. Now, what's hard about India, I'm going to put it B tier for now. Whoa, look at that. I'm going to put it B tier for now. It's very hard to view India without considering its modern infrastructure. Even though I said we weren't going to take any of that into account, it is kind of hard to ignore in the case of India. That being said, I think in terms of landmass, land size, it's like 7th or 8th in the world. I think it's somewhere, how big is India? Like 3 million square kilometers, somewhere around there. Maybe 3.5. So it's not gigantic. It's not an amazingly large country, but by no means is it small either. It's got a good amount of water access. It's not especially susceptible to water-based invasions compared to other places. Land, it does get absolutely fucking slam dunked on. Actually, these two maps being like this is kind of throwing me off. I think this is how it should go. Like I said, India probably is one of the most, if not the most controversial countries on this list. But I think B tier, somewhere in between Germany and France, is fine. For now, we may revisit that, we may not, I don't know. So going across the world, we have Brazil. Now, Brazil is kind of an interesting country. Now, I'm going to throw this out there as a rating, and I will explain myself, but I feel like people will not be very happy with it. Here you go. It's A tier. I'm going to just say Brazil is an A tier country in terms of geography. The nice thing about Brazil is that at first glance, it appears pretty susceptible to sea-based invasions until you realize that, if you look at Brazil sort of as like an arrow, where this arrow is pointing right here, there's nothing. There's nothing for an incredibly long time. There's such a huge gap there that no country from, the other continents could really ever fuck with Brazil, realistically. So the biggest threats here are definitely land-based invasions. But here's the thing. Brazil is pretty well defended. And what I mean by that, of course, is if we look at the countries surrounding Brazil, Brazil is at such a size difference. I mean, size doesn't mean everything, but when you're this much bigger than your potential enemies, what that means is that you can take your battles while retreating, and you can really give up a lot more land than another country might be able to. Brazil also has, like we said earlier, I guess we didn't say the rainforest, but there are tropical forests in Brazil. If we think about the Amazon in particular, it covers a lot of northwestern Brazil, which acts as a pretty good natural barrier to any serious northern-based invasion, which means that it would come from the south. Now, obviously, the invasion would come from the south. Anyone with a brain could look at this and say, if you were going to invade Brazil, you should do it from the south. But the thing is, if your country is really only susceptible to an air-based invasion, kind of, and a land-based invasion from one specific direction, I think you're doing pretty good. And so I think Brazil deserves A tier. So next up, we have none other than the second largest country in the world, second largest country in the world, Canada. Canada is... Where should we put Canada? I'm going to say Canada is F tier. Now, here's why I think Canada is F tier. We talked a little bit before with Brazil, to paraphrase myself, about how one thing you need to keep into account is how powerful are your neighbors. And what we talked about earlier was how many neighbors. Now, the amount of neighbors isn't as important as how powerful. I mean, if you're surrounded by 20 countries, but none of them can even, hope to stand against you, that's not as scary as if you have one country boarding you that could absolutely fucking steamroll you. And why Canada in specific is so bad is because if it were to be invaded, it is fucked when it comes to a land-based invasion. And what is even worse is if Canada, let's say Canada were to go down and invade the United States, that's not really, it's not very cash money of them, but it's not a huge deal for the U.S. What the U.S. can do is just move a little more south. Well, the thing about Canada is much like Russia, where, northern Canada is fucking hell. It's, it literally is cold, icy hell. I've been up there several times. It's not very fun. Certainly, most people in the modern world would not do well if forced to live there on short notice. So, what that essentially means here is that not only do we have this incredibly large landmass attached to it in Alaska, but what we see here is that if some threat were to come from the United States, Canada would be forced to go where? North. And whereas the United States, no big deal, we just go south, it gets slightly warmer. Really, there's no huge climate change. As Canadians are forced further north, I mean, we're talking about getting into inhospitably cold environments. On top of that, it is hugely susceptible to sea. I mean, many years ago, the north of Canada wouldn't be something you could feasibly invade. But with modern technology, really every direction every side of Canada that has water is absolutely fuckable. So it gets owned by land, it gets owned by sea. Obviously, air, it's, similar. It's not especially susceptible to air. But so it has this combination of getting absolutely owned by land, owned by sea, and then having a huge land mass of like 9.9 million square kilometers, but so much of it is not easy to use or just completely unusable. On top of that, it's fragmented into a lot of small islands, which means that a quick northern retreat isn't even going to be that easy past a certain point because you're going to be hopping island to island. So Canada, in my opinion, I'm sorry, but I think Canada is F tier. I mean, I honestly don't think that you could talk me above an F tier for this. Okay, so next up, I think we're going to do top 15 actually, because I don't want this to be like a 58-minute video. I don't actually know how long I've even been going on for. Time flies when you're having fun. But let's talk about South Korea, if I can find it here. So South Korea, in my opinion, is... Here's where I want to put it. I want to put it similarly to Japan. Here's why I don't think that it's necessarily on the... So functionally, South Korea is an island, right? Obviously, it's not an island. But if we look at it on a map, obviously it's got that big bad brother to the north. And then, he's connected to some shit. But really, as much as it hates me to do this, I might have to drop South Korea to F tier. Because if we think about... historically, Korea's track record's been pretty good. But... historical data can only be useful for so much. If we look at this realistically, they're they're not especially susceptible to a land-based invasion. I mean, it's really only... in fact, they're pretty good against a land-based invasion. It's really only one place that it can come from. The only option to invade Korea by land is to just absolutely steamroll them with overwhelming force. Now, whether or not that's possible, it completely irrelevant. What the main problem for Korea is that they are absolutely 100 times more susceptible than Japan when it comes to a sea-based invasion. Now, here's the thing. Japan is actually an island. On top of that, it's not attached to a hostile or even just another country. So, if South Korea is invaded by sea, they don't have anywhere to go except... their main escape route would be via the ocean. So they can't really run up. They can't go north. And that wouldn't be a problem if we're talking about the United States, Brazil, China, Russia, Canada. Well, it would be a problem with Russia and Canada. But one of these larger countries, it wouldn't really matter. But South Korea is a very small country, so there isn't a whole lot of room to, squirrel around in. So I think I'm going to drop it to D tier. I mean, there's nothing especially wrong with the little bit of land they do have, but that's just it. They have very little land. On top of that, if a threat were to come via the ocean, they're fucked. And I just think that means, they're semi similar to Japan. Functionally, like we said, they're an island, but they're just worse than Japan. I will put South Korea above the UK though. Fuck them. Oh, next up. Okay, so when I made this, or when I had this idea for the list, there was one country, or no, sorry, two countries that I knew for certain absolutely were F tier. One of them is Canada, and the next one is, well, the next country we're going to talk about, Australia. Absolutely F tier. Are you kidding? Get out of my face. Australia is the worst country in the world based on geography. We're talking about Russia, right? Where like a huge chunk of their land is inhospitable. Australia probably has the single highest ratio of unusable and unlivable land of any country that will ever exist. If there was a god who created the earth, he was in a horrible mood when he created Australia. He made a place that is absolutely heinous to live in. Now here's the thing, again, similar to Russia, you may have 7.8 million square kilometers or 7.7 million square kilometers of land. The problem is almost none of it is worthwhile. Now, here's the thing. I'm sure you've all read the proposals about a Great Australian Channel that basically cuts a hole through the middle of the country to let water flow through from one part of the ocean to another. Or I suppose maybe that would even be one ocean to another. Anyways, the thing is that hasn't happened and probably won't. Maybe ever, but if it does, it won't be for a long time. It'll be very expensive, but very worthwhile. But here's the thing. Australia obviously is immune to a land invasion. That's basically the only plus that Australia has. In fact, the one thing I'll say about Australia is I can't believe that they're in the top 15 for GDP, or they were 2 years ago, because goddamn, they gotta be the heart. We all know it's because of mining, right? Australia has, I think diamond mines aren't relevant to what we're talking about, because functionally diamonds are fucking worthless. Again, that's irrelevant. So they're immune to a land-based attack. Now, that's, like I said, the only plus Australia has. What they have is a large landmass that is mostly useless. So since they're immune to land, we got to start talking about sea-based invasions. Well, here's the thing. You remember what we talked about with South Korea, right? Where their only option really would be to go up, which would be very frustrating even if the country bordering you wasn't openly hostile, it would still probably be annoying to basically do that. Australia doesn't have that option. Literally, their only option. If you look, 90% of the population of Australia lives in 5 places along the coast. And so if you were to invade, their only option is to go further inland. Well, the problem is, once you get slightly inland with, in Australia, you are dead. You die. Australia, worst country. I absolutely love the fact that you're able to make a lot of money in this fucking hell world, but you suck. So I believe next up is Spain. Now, Spain is a country I have fond memories of, not because of anything they've done, but because for 3 years in a row in elementary school, I had to write a report on Spain. Now, I'm putting Spain C tier for now, and I'll sort of talk to myself about this. Obviously, it's a video. I can't talk to anyone else. And see if I can't figure out more specifically where it should be and why. So one thing I've always thought that really sort of damaged Spain as a whole was just the existence of Portugal. It would really be best for Spain if they could absorb that, because Spain, in my opinion, would be one, maybe 2 tiers higher than wherever it will end up being if Portugal didn't exist. Now, Spain isn't a small country. I would say Spain is an average sized country in the grand scheme of things. So it doesn't lose points for being too small, but it also doesn't gain points for having an overwhelming amount of size. It gains points, I would say, on usable land. As far as I know, there's no part of land, or there's no big chunks of land in Spain where it's just inhospitable. You can't grow anything, can't raise anything. I think Spain is pretty usable. For the most part, honestly, I think Spain is sort of an average country. I mean, the one thing I see it having go for it is really it's pretty decent against land-based attacks because, like I said, if you have an overwhelming size advantage over a bordering country, especially, I mean, Portugal's in a very strange position. If you see Portugal right here, it looks like it's being swallowed by Spain. So, really, they're negligible when it comes to a land threat. And the other point where a land threat could come into Spain is essentially one huge choke point. So they're actually very well off, or fairly well off, in terms of defending against land-based threats. They're not in any huge risk of natural disasters. But other than that, I mean, there's just not a whole lot that's bumping Spain up for me. I mean, as much as I love those Iberico pigs and the meat that comes from them, I mean, I'll keep importing it, I'll keep buying it, but I don't think that Spain is going higher than C tier. I think Spain is like the quintessential average country. Now, Japan is C tier, but it's punching up. You know, it's hitting above its weight class. Japan probably, if it weren't for the perfect set of circumstances that led to Japan being formed the way it is, would probably be much lower on this list, D or F tier. I mean, it would just be a shitty small island, but because of the way its land mass aligns, it's C tier. So, but I think Spain is C tier just based off of being very average. And last but not least, we have none other than Mexico. Now, here's the thing about Mexico. I'm tempted to put it C tier, but I think it belongs somewhere in D tier. I think it is the highest end of D tier. Now, hear me out. Mexico's in kind of a weird, precarious situation where to their north border is taken up by one country of overwhelming size and strength. And to their south is many, many different countries. So remember that equation we talked about earlier where it's like it's scarier to be bordered by one absolutely dominant country than it is to be bordered by 20 lesser countries? Well, the thing is, Mexico kind of has both of that. So really that sucks. What Mexico does have is good water access. It is fairly susceptible to a land invasion. It's not very big. I would describe the environment of Mexico as harsh but livable. You know, it's not Australia level bad, but it's also not great. I mean, you're starting to get a little warm, a little deserty. So it means your options are limited, but that doesn't mean they're not there. I think Mexico, I'm sorry to say this, I think it's D tier. Oh my god, I just realized we forgot Italy. Oh fuck. I'm so sorry. I forgot Italy. I'll put it, just as an apology, I'll put it A tier for now. I can't believe, holy shit, how did I forget Italy? I'm such a fool. Honestly, if you want to leave a dislike on the video for that, I completely understand. Italy is top 10, and I just disrespected it by not only having it last, but just forgetting about it. Jesus, that is embarrassing. All I can really do is say I'm sorry. Okay, well, we may have forgot Italy, but let's start talking. So, I'm initially thinking C tier because of similar reasons to Spain. I mean, Italy is an alpine country, meaning that the Alps mountain range is in it to some degree. It's not an especially big country. It's not tiny either. I would say Italy is on the smaller side, but it's definitely workable. What I would say about Italy, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that if, let's talk continental warfare. Let's say continents had to go to war with continents. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Italy might just be the linchpin versus Africa. I think that when it comes to Africa, Italy would play a, if again we're talking continental warfare, Italy would play a much bigger part than people would anticipate, and that's just because the country's sort of just naturally shaped like a naval base anyways. Again, they're actually very well off. I mean, so what I consider well off for land-based invasions and threats is a country that naturally has a choke point. And if we look, you can only come to Italy from one side, and it's fairly narrow. So, I mean, obviously it's very wide. It's a fucking country. I understand that. But basically, your enemies, you don't have to predict where they're going to go. They can only go one way, which makes defending against them, forcing a stalemate, very easy. On top of that, Italy's actually not as bad off as you'd think from sea invasions. It looks like they're totally surrounded, but yeah, I think this is where Italy belongs. I think bottom of C tier, but C tier nonetheless. A lot of people would probably put Italy D tier, maybe even below Mexico. Maybe some fucking psycho idiots with no brain in their head would put it even below Russia. But I'm putting Italy high, dude. I'm putting Italy C tier because of reasons. So there you have it. There is the top 15 countries in the world going off of GDP via the World Bank from 2018. This is them ranked on their geography. There's some that I could be convinced, like, you might be able to convince me to switch, like, India and France. In fact, I might do that. I've convinced myself just now. United States is God tier. United States is absolutely the pinnacle of geographical advantage. No one, and I mean no one, will convince me otherwise. There's some, like, there's some that honestly I didn't want to put it, like Brazil. I didn't want to put Brazil as high as I did put it, but when I actually really looked at it and I looked at maps and I touched up on the geography of Brazil, I realized that it's actually a pretty damn underrated country. And then there are some, like, people who live in Canada and people who live in Australia are probably salty, but, like, here's the thing, dude. I didn't make your country. I mean, I do consider myself something of a god, but I'm not like a world-building god, more of a world-ending god, really. I didn't choose to make your countries horrible. It's sort of like don't shoot the messenger. Just because Canada is a fucking fractured mess of ice-ridden, god-forsaken land, that has nothing to do with me. And it's funny to me that Canada and Australia both ended up F tier. They're basically F tier for the same reason on opposite ends of the spectrum. Australia, big hot. Canada, big fucking cold. The United Kingdom, the disgust I feel when looking at the landmass that is the United Kingdom is honestly undescribable. But I was respectful and I was reasonable putting it at the bottom of D tier. And I will not budge from that. Other than that, I think this is a pretty good tier list. As I said, we're not going to go over... There's so many countries. I mean, my God, there are a lot of countries. I'll do one more for you guys. Egypt is B tier. There you go. I'll see you guys with another video soon.